Hi, everyone. We'll be starting soon. We're waiting for everyone to hop on. Got a few more minutes. And we'll plan to start right at 12. Hope everyone's day is going well and there's a little bit of sunshine, at least in the San Jose area today, so that's good.
At least for a day more, right? Before the rain comes back in.
Which we can't complain about.
Not at all.
I feel like we need music or something. Well, I see the numbers of attendees slowly increasing.
Happy to be
one more minute. Okay, all right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining King Wealth Planning and the Alzheimer's Association today for this educational event. My name is Shannon Corpus, and I'm a financial advisor at King Wealth Planning and a registered representative for LPL Financial. And I have to tell you all, when I first saw this presentation, I was just in awe. I learned so much about what I didn't know and needed to know. Because number one, you don't know what you don't know, right? And number two, we all have someone in our lives impacted by Alzheimer's in some way. And that brings us to today and why we felt so compelled to share this incredible information with the community. We're thrilled to be collaborating with the Alzheimer's Association on this effort, and I hope that Claire's words will resonate with you today. First things first, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website at a later date. We will address questions at the end of the session, so please email questions to kwp@kingwealth.com. And King Wealth Planning is hosting this event today, so let me open with some background on King Wealth Planning. King Wealth Planning helps individuals and families manage their financial affairs at any stage of life. We are an ethics, relationship, and service committed financial firm that has been in business for over 35 years. We like to say we guide you through the ups and downs of your financial life, and that's exactly what we do. We help you to navigate the ever-changing financial world and how it relates to you. We pride ourselves on the relationships we've built with our clients and partners to bring more than just financial planning and wealth management services to our clients. Oops, sorry about that. Clicked on the wrong screen. These are the service areas in which we can help you and your family. And over the years, we've built extensive network of partnerships with subject matter experts and can offer collaborative support, excuse me, that elevates King Wealth Planning above the rest. For more information, please see our website at www.kingwealth.com. We're so happy to have Claire Day from the Alzheimer's Association with us today, and here's a little bit about Claire. She's been on the staff at the Alzheimer's Association since 2001. She is the Chief Program Officer at the Northern California and Northern Nevada chapter, and as such, oversees all care and support operations and research initiatives. Claire Day is a clinical social worker and received her degree from Bloomsburg University of Pennsylvania. She has more than 20 years of experience as a family and professional educator in dementia care and has authored 2 forewords to Alzheimer's caregiver books. In 2018, she was appointed the chapter lead for the U.S. study to project brain health through lifestyle interventions to reduce risk in California in partnership with UC Davis. US Pointer is US Pointer is a 2-year clinical trial to evaluate whether lifestyle interventions that simultaneously target multiple risk factors protect cognitive function in older adults at increased risk for cognitive decline. Again, we're thrilled to have Claire to share this information. Take it away, Claire.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you so much. And thank you to King Wealth Planning for inviting us here today. We are going to talk a little bit today about the landscape of Alzheimer's and dementia and science, what you need to know, including early detection, why that's more important than ever in the age and era of new treatment, as well as some of those advances in clinical trials and some of those lifestyle tips. What can we all be doing to decrease our risk of developing Alzheimer's disease and dementia? Next slide, please. But I always like to start off with a little bit of level setting of why we're here, why this is such an important topic. And you'll notice that this says 2023 Alzheimer's disease facts and figures. And we are about 3 weeks away from the launch of our annual facts and figures report. We kind of call this our report card on the state of Alzheimer's and dementia in the United States. But as of last year's numbers, you can see here why this is such an important topic. More than 6 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's disease. And by 2050, which used to feel really, really far in the future and doesn't feel so far away anymore, that number is expected to double should we not be able to find a way to change the trajectory of Alzheimer's and dementia. And I think one of the things that is a concern for us and why it's always so great to have the opportunity to reach new audiences is Alzheimer's disease is on the rise. And that's partly because we're an aging nation. We're the first of the boomers turned 65 in 2011. And this is our greatest decade of potential for aging older Americans. Yet other deaths have decreased. Deaths from other diseases have decreased. And you can see here over the span of almost 20 years, deaths from heart disease, for example, have decreased by 7.3%, where deaths from Alzheimer's disease have increased by 145%. Now, some of that is statistics, right? Some of that is because we are doing a better job today than we were 20 years ago of diagnosing Alzheimer's disease and recognizing it as a cause of death. But it also is that statistic at the bottom, which is 1 in 3 seniors dies with Alzheimer's or another dementia. So I urge you to take a listen out in the next month or so for our annual Facts and Figures report of 2024. Every year there will be a special report. We don't quite know what that's going to be yet. It's a little bit of a surprise, but it just helps us to understand why everybody needs to be talking about Alzheimer's disease, talking about how we can help each other and what we can all be doing today. Next slide, please. So dementia, let's start with a little bit of basics. So dementia is what we call an umbrella term. Dementia and Alzheimer's disease, you may have heard them used interchangeably, but they are two different things. Dementia, think of it as that overall term used to describe a range of symptoms that are associated with cognitive decline, things like our memory, behaviors, psychological symptoms. Underneath that umbrella would be the different biological changes in your brain that are causing those symptoms. So if you think of the top word of like the word flowers, underneath you'd see tulips and daffodils and roses and petunias, all those different types of flowers. They're all described as those beautiful, colorful things that grow in the garden. But they all have a little bit of difference to them. And that's the same way we like to think about dementia. So the biology of someone with Alzheimer's disease versus vascular dementia or Lewy body dementia or frontotemporal dementia, that biology in the brain is going to be different. But what you're going to see is some similarities around those cognitive, behavioral, and psychological changes and symptoms. Alzheimer's disease, as you can see, is the most common cause of dementia. It is unfortunately not uncommon to have more than one type of dementia. And while some causes of cognitive decline could be reversible, what we're talking about here are the ones that progress over time and at this point are not reversible. Next slide, please. And we'll get into a little bit of why it's important to understand the difference between the different types of dementia. And here you can see the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease in particular, and this has never been more important than it is today, as we do now have a treatment that's available for people who have Alzheimer's disease, have that underlying biology of Alzheimer's disease that could actually improve cognition, which 20 years ago we didn't have. So Alzheimer's disease under a microscope looks a little bit like this lovely picture here, which is great to show at the noontime hour. But you can see it's this buildup of beta amyloid, a plaque that develops in our brain. And what that does is it sort of deposits around our brain and stops our cells from working. It kills off the cells in our brain. And the other hallmark of the disease is what we call a tau protein or a tau tangle, these neurofibrillary tangles. So tau protein is a transport system in our brain. It carries messages in our brain from one part of the brain to another. And imagine picturing like a railroad track. That's how tau moves throughout our brain. What happens in the brain of someone with Alzheimer's disease is that track that it's carried on gets shifted or kinked in a sense. And what happens is the tau stops right there. Think of it like a train track. When the train comes off the rails, the train doesn't move anymore. And that's what's happening in the brain of someone with Alzheimer's disease. And you can see this is a biological change that's impacting parts of the brain that are responsible for memory, thinking, cognition, all of those things. And when you look at that image on the right, it's very clear to see that this is a biological change. You can see large gaps in our brain where our function should be really at its best are weakened. And that atrophy, that shrinking of the brain is what causes those symptoms that we know as Alzheimer's disease. Next slide, please. Now, what we've also learned over the years is what impacts our risk of cognitive decline or dementia. Now, when we're talking about risk of dementia, we're sort of talking a little bit more in that general term of that umbrella term of overall all dementias. And there are things on the left side of that screen that we call those non-modifiable risks. These are the things that we can't change. we're all getting older every day, and I noticed in my introduction, I've said more than 20 years of experience working in blah, blah, blah. And that was when I'd only been with the association for 10 years, and now I've been here for 23 years, so I might have to change that to another decade. We can't change that, right? We're getting older every day. We cannot change our genetics. We cannot change our race and ethnicity, all things that put us at an increased risk of developing dementia, including our gender. We cannot change our sex at birth. Women are impacted more than men are. There was always the assumption that it was because women lived longer, but in reality, there may be more going on under the surface that impacts that risk. Same with genes, same with race and ethnicity. But then there are these yellow circles. These are what we call those modifiable risk factors. These are all the fun things that no one wants to talk about, like eating right and exercising and thinking about good heart health and getting enough sleep and good sleep. But there are some things that we can be doing that have been studied that may impact our risk and decrease our risk. And so what we talk about when we think of these things is, how can we maximize understanding what puts us at the least amount of risk possible? What things can we do today? How do social determinants of health factor into that? And when I look at environmental and lifestyle factors, and we think about things like air pollution, certainly social determinants of health come into play in that. Not everybody can move out of big cities that might be at higher risk for air pollution, or work in industries where they're exposed to things that could or could not be increasing their risk but are being studied. And I think what's really important to note is that we can also do all of these things on the right side of that circle and still develop Alzheimer's disease. So it's one part of a very large puzzle that's taken over 100 years to even get a scratch at the surface to try and understand. Next slide, please. So one of the places we've made some really great improvements over the last several years is around early detection and diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Next slide, please. We do know that early detection matters. And today, about 50% of people living with Alzheimer's disease have never been formally diagnosed by their healthcare professional. And yet you can see all the reasons here why early detection matters. It helps you to understand what your symptoms are. It helps you to explore treatment options, which 5 years ago didn't really mean much, but means a lot more today with the era of new treatment. It helps to think about improving health outcomes. And we actually have some data from a clinical trial that used a PET scan to aid in diagnosis, that actually showed people who were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease inappropriately had that diagnosis reversed, and then those who were diagnosed without Alzheimer's disease, who actually had the evidence of amyloid on their brain and received the proper diagnosis. That improves our health outcomes. It allows us to actually know what it is that we have, that we could be then taking some steps to think about eating right a little bit differently or exercising a little bit more, even once diagnosed. It can help to prevent complications. Oftentimes, those who have been not diagnosed will have some sort of a medical emergency that ends up in the ER, which is going to include complications, make it more of a cost to both the patient and the healthcare system. It also helps families and the person diagnosed to make those legal and financial decisions, to think about who it is they want in charge of their financial future. Who is it that they want making decisions about their health care when they are no longer able to voice that themselves? Everybody should have that opportunity to put that person they trust the most in charge of those important things. And it also helps to think about care services, as well as the opportunity to potentially participate in a clinical trial if that person were interested in doing so. Next slide, please. Today, we are stuck a little bit on this right side of how we think about diagnosing Alzheimer's disease, but it is time to modernize the diagnosis, and science is helping us advance that in a big way. And that's using something called biomarkers. And I'll get into biomarkers a little bit on the next slide. But Right now, what typically happens for the most part is that families or patients go into a healthcare setting and we do a number of tests to rule out things that could be causing the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And we do things like cognitive tests where we have to count backwards from 100 by sevens, and memory tests and other tests that could be looking for brain tumors or signs of infections, things that could be causing symptoms. We are close to really getting to this left side of this block where we have the ability to use these biomarkers once we are symptomatic to identify whether or not the presence of a disease exists for Alzheimer's disease and soon, hopefully, other types of dementia. This is important for the future because of the way we could think about actually diagnosing the disease prior to any cognitive symptoms. Because what's happening in my brain today, if I were to develop symptoms, the cognitive symptoms of Alzheimer's disease in my 70s, that buildup of amyloid plaque and those tau tangles are starting to accumulate today in my brain. 20 years potentially before I see any cognitive changes. So as we see advances in science and advances in treatment, we need to modernize the way we think about the diagnosis as well. And biomarkers are going to lead the way in helping us do that. Next slide, please. So what are these biomarkers that I'm talking about? Well, you might not be familiar with the term, but the word biomarker or biological marker, it's a part of us. It's a biological part of us that shows evidence of disease. And we've seen some really great advancements over the last 2 decades in PET scans, positron emissions tomography tests. These are scans that we can take of the brain that actually show whether or not there's the presence of amyloid, whether or not there's the presence of the tau protein. Something that you can't see on a CAT scan, you can't see on an MRI, but you can see them in these sophisticated machines. And now there are these compounds that show both of those potential biomarkers. The other things that are really emerging, you can see here on the right side of the screen, things like retinal scans, not quite as advanced, but really fascinating and something that, pun intended, I'm keeping my eye on, to really think about how something as simple as an eye test, how thinking of working with your annual ophthalmology visit might in the future be a way that we also think about this overall cognitive health is really fascinating. And I think when you think about health equity and you think about accessibility, that's where these biomarkers start to think about changing the game. But in the middle is where the rubber meets the road of how we could potentially get biomarkers into clinical practice sooner rather than later. And that's by our good old blood tests. And if you think about what a blood test looks like today for a biomarker of other diseases, think about cholesterol and blood sugar. It's not uncommon, I would think, that many of you have had a test where they've drawn your blood to test for maybe your cholesterol level or to see what your blood sugar is like. That is a biomarker. That's a way that we validated a blood test to be able to show evidence of disease. And we are closer than ever at having that available for Alzheimer's disease as well. Now, I want to emphasize this is not ready for prime time yet. You cannot walk into your doctor's office today, but we're closer than ever at getting there. And I think the next slide will help us illustrate that a little bit. So we're sort of in this new era of diagnostics for blood tests and for something called cerebral spinal fluid or a spinal tap, right? That's where they'll do a cerebral spinal tap to test. That is an FDA approved test on the market today. However, I think if I could see all of your faces today and we were to raise our hands to say, who thinks a spinal tap is a non-invasive, easy, fun way to get tested for anything? I don't think any of you would be raising your hands. I can see Shannon is shaking her head to say no. It's there. It's being used really effectively in research. What it shows is 100% whether or not someone has the evidence of amyloid. So it's really useful, but it's not user-friendly and it's not, I would say, non-invasive. But a blood test, a little bit different. And you can see here there's a race to really uncover some of these fluid-based biomarkers to aid in diagnostics that are currently being used today to improve the way we think about clinical trials. There are 3 emerging blood tests that are close to being on the market. They're not FDA approved yet. So while you could get them, they've not been fully vetted by the FDA, but many are under review. And then if we go to the next slide, I think we'll go dive a little bit deeper into some recent science that came out from the Alzheimer's Association International Conference just last July. What I love about this is getting us one step closer to the clinic. And there were 2 tests in particular I want to mention here. One was a finger prick test. So not even like a blood draw where they're taking a vial of your blood. This is a simple finger prick. If you've ever donated blood before, you know that they will check your, do a finger prick test to check for iron, to make sure that your iron's high enough to donate. It's that type of a test. And what was really great about this test is that they used these samples, they dried them, and they shipped them without cooling between 2 countries. Now, you might wonder why that's important. The way we think about a blood draw, scientists have to think about every potential piece of that blood draw from the time it is taken from you to the type of container it's stored in, the temperature it's stored in, how long it's kept at what temperature before it's tested to validate those responses or validate those tests. So if we could replicate this was a smaller study, but it's showing a lot of promise. If we could replicate this finger prick test, think about the accessibility in being able to administer this type of a test without the need for immediate cooling. That's pretty cool to think about. The second study that I want to mention was also pretty interesting. The patients and participants in this clinical trial, they went through 3 testing ways. They had a blood draw. They were evaluated by a physician using traditional history and cognition that we use today. And then they had a PET scan. And when they compared the PET scan to the blood draw and to the history and cognition, the blood test was 80% accurate in identifying Alzheimer's related changes compared to 55% accurate without that blood testing. And that's through history and cognition. Now, why is there such a discrepancy? It's not a criticism of the diagnostic workup. It's that the diagnostic workup is subjective. If I asked you to count backwards from 100 by 7, some of you might be able to do that easily. Some of you, even cognitively normally, might not be able to get past 86, like me, right? Sometimes math's not my strong suit. So that's a subjective test result. There are other pieces of a cognitive workup that are subjective. And so you could do really well on some of those tests and have some pretty significant cognitive changes. And I think vice versa, you could do not so well on them and actually it not be more of a cognitive change than it is maybe just a test taking issue. So there's certainly, we're not ready for prime time with these yet, but it is exciting to see that science is catching up, that we've seen in some other diseases in the ways we test and diagnose to get Alzheimer's into that sort of more mainstream accepted way. And at the same time, we're working with health systems to help prepare physicians for what this could look like in a future. Next slide, please. So that's a lot about how we work up to that diagnosis. What happens now, right? So what do we do? What progress is being made towards risk reduction and more effective treatments? And this is where we really start to see some of this come to fruition. Next slide, please. So this is a very, very busy slide to tell you that we have come a long way since Alzheimer's disease was first identified back in 1906. You can see that handsome fellow there on the left-hand side of your screen. That's Dr. Alois Alzheimer. He had a patient back in the early 1900s. Her name was Auguste Dieter, and she was exhibiting signs that were being treated as a psychiatric syndrome, but he didn't see her as a typical clinical presentation that he was used to seeing. So he followed her for a year, and after she passed away, he got permission to do an autopsy of her brain, and that's where he found what we now know to be the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, that buildup of beta amyloid in the brain and those neurofibrillary tangles. Now, beta amyloid, I should have mentioned when we showed that screen earlier, we all have beta amyloid in our brain, but for a cognitively normal person, that beta amyloid doesn't build up. It sort of sweeps away regularly, like almost like a cleaning of your brain. And for some reason in the brains of Alzheimer's, it doesn't. It builds up, and that's what stops our cells from working. So he was the first person to see these. That's why we now call Alzheimer's after Dr. Alzheimer. But you can see it was 90 years later before we had any sort of a treatment, even for symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Now, you can imagine why, right? You can't just open up someone's head and look at crack their skull and take a look at what's happening under the hood of someone who's living. And so for many, many years, we were reliant on people who had passed away and donated their brains to learn about Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Through the advancement of technology, through PET scans, we can see things a little bit differently now, and it's helping us to advance science in different ways. But these first three medications that you see here, these first three treatments, Aricept, Exelon, and Razodine, are all designed to do that, treat symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. They're not improving cognition. They're not going to make somebody, their short-term recall all of a sudden get better. And they're all designed to do the same thing. They're a class of medication called acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, just 3 different manufacturers that are designed to do the same thing. In 2003, there was a 4th medication that was added to the compilation of therapies for Alzheimer's disease, and that's called Namenda or memantine. Namenda is a glutamate modulator that's really designed for, and if you look below, you can see the stages of where a patient would really be introduced to these medications. Typically in the mild to moderate stage for some of the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. Aricept and Exelon have recently received FDA approval through all stages of the disease. But you can see Namenda is not meant to be given in the early stage. It is for moderate stage Alzheimer's disease, and is often paired together with the other 3 medications, or one of the other 3 medications. So in 2014, you can see here the makers of Aricept and Namenda came together to develop a 1-dose medication of both of those medications together. So they're treating symptoms. It's hard to know, if there is a change in the brain because of those medications. It's not what they're designed to do. But in 2021, we saw some advances in the way we think about treating Alzheimer's disease with medications or treatments that actually could slow the disease progression and change that underlying biology of the disease. And those are the 2 medications named Aduhelm and Leqembi. Those are what we call monoclonal antibodies. They are infusions that are given every 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the medication. And there is evidence that when used in the earliest stage of the disease, that has the maximum benefit. And you can see here, they actually have changed or slowed the disease progression and have improved cognition, function, and behavior in patients that received it at the earliest stage of the disease. Now, this is groundbreaking. This was news to celebrate when you think about how long it took us to get anywhere close to here. And yet you'll notice that the title of this slide specifically says Alzheimer's disease. These are therapies only for the underlying biology of Alzheimer's disease, those plaques and tangles. And so it's really important that we recognize that while this is a really remarkable step forward in science, it is a small step up a very large hill when it comes to understanding how these medications work, and then thinking about those related dementias, thinking about those other types of dementia that could be causing the same types of symptoms. These medications won't work for that. Now, what we also saw in 2020 and 2023 was 2 medications that had been approved for insomnia and agitation actually be studied within the Alzheimer's disease population to show that they are safe to be given in an Alzheimer's disease population. Prior to that, medications used to help in sleep and agitation had never been studied with people with dementia. We know people with dementia and Alzheimer's are more risk for falls. These medications can actually make confusion worse, not better. So it was really important that they be studied within the Alzheimer's disease population. So some definite improvements in the way we're thinking about treatments. And it is exciting, and we still have a long way to go. And so we're starting to see more and more of what we call the monoclonal antibodies reporting out. In fact, if we go to the next slide, we'll see that there's a third one that's under FDA review now. It does not have approval yet. But you can also see that the monoclonal antibodies cannot be the only game in town. And so this right side just gives you a great picture of what else is being tested today in clinical trial. Because as exciting as it was, and I remember we had a board member after Leqembi was approved by the FDA who said, well, like, drop the mic, what do we do now? It's not quite that simple, right? This is one really important step, but it is just the beginning of where we need to go when it comes to understanding Alzheimer's disease, when it comes to understanding dementia in particular, and how we can treat these diseases effectively to actually be able to stave off the cognition changes. And if we go to the next slide, I just want to give a little bit of an update on donanemab, the trial that's under FDA review right now. What's exciting about donanemab, which, and if you think about, so I mentioned there were 3 acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. And now this is the potential of a 3rd monoclonal antibody. It's not unusual that therapeutics take a similar path, and with each one, there's the potential that they get a little bit stronger. And we definitely are seeing that with the monoclonal antibodies. What's unique about donanemab is that prior to the beginning of these infusions, participants were predetermined the level of amyloid clearing that their brain needed. So they would do a PET scan and determine how much amyloid clearing was needed per patient. So what that meant was that study participants stopped the therapeutic after anywhere from 12 to 18 months, depending on how much amyloid they had on their brain. When you think of cost savings and you think of a future and the realities of being able to bring these drugs into the real world, that's certainly encouraging to think that these may not be lifelong medications that patients would have to go on. So we're keeping our eye on that. We should expect the FDA to give a ruling on that sometime in the first quarter of the year. Next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about what puts us at risk for Alzheimer's disease. We've talked about what Alzheimer's is, why it's important to detect it, thinking about treatment, and now let's talk a little bit about what we can all do to reduce our risks, because it is going to be a future where we're talking about all of this. It will not be a one-size-fits-all answer. Even if we found that magic answer tomorrow, it will most likely come with the combination of lifestyle changes as well as potentials for other therapeutics down the road. And there's some really great science going on that's showing us the importance of how what's good for our heart can be good for our brain. And it's believed that up to 40% of some of our dementia cases could be prevented or delayed by targeting some of these modifiable risk factors. And there is some research that suggests that putting them all together would potentially give us the most maximum benefit. Today, these things have all been studied successfully individually, but there are studies happening that I'll talk about that are combining them together. Next slide, please. So first, let's start with a little bit of how some of our other systems work together to potentially impact our brain health. This was a study that came out this past year at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference that looked at gut health, our microbiome, and how in this particular case, constipation had an impact on brain health. And in this particular study, people who had chronic constipation, so these are people who went 3 or more days without a bowel movement, had a 73% decrease on cognitive scores, which was equal to 3 years of aging. And so the key messages here are about how, first of all, everything that happens below the neck is impacting what's happening above the neck. All of our systems are connected. So it makes sense to think about how that might have an impact on our brain health, but it's also one of those most modifiable risk factors, right? So if there are absolutely great things we can do if you're suffering from constipation, and thinking about how to keep our good gut health and keep our gut healthy. Next slide, please. The next study I want to share with you is about ultra-processed foods. And you can imagine how much fun I am at cocktail parties between good gut health and now taking away your Twinkies at a party. But this is a really important study that talks about how if our daily intake, our daily caloric intake is comprised of more than 20% of these ultra-processed foods. So an ultra-processed food are those foods that are high in sugar and probably a lot of ingredients you can't pronounce and fat. But the key to make them ultra processed means they're also low in fiber and they're low in protein. So they really don't have a lot of nutritional benefit. Consuming more than 20% of these in your daily caloric intake was associated with a 28% faster decline in global cognitive scores. So again, key takeaway for this is make some of those small changes to take some of these healthy actions and reduce some of the intake of these ultra-processed foods. And certainly concerning when we think about ultra-processed foods make up more than 50% of American diets. And so this is where we start to see when we get some of the evidence from these studies, how we can incorporate them into brain health, not just for older adults, but at a much younger age to sort of right some of those healthy habits. Next slide, please. This next study talked about physical activity, and we've studied physical activity in cognitively normal older adults to see what might have the best outcome for protecting our brain health. And the Cliff Notes answer is that it might not be one specific type of exercise, but it's more about getting a good aerobic workout, that rate of exertion, really kind of breaking a sweat 3 to 4 times minimum a week. But what this study looked at, the EXERT study, was physical activity in people who had mild cognitive impairment. Now, we talked a little bit in the beginning about Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and I should have probably included that slide that talked about the continuum of cognitive impairment, because mild cognitive impairment is what some people call a precursor to Alzheimer's disease. Mild cognitive impairment is enough impairment that it shows up on our clinical testing, so those history and cognition tests which show up, but it's not interfering with our activities of daily living. So when you progress into Alzheimer's disease, you start to have trouble with things like finances or making your grocery list, like those day-to-day things you start to need a little bit more help for. Now, what's interesting about mild cognitive impairment is while it is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, not everybody who has mild cognitive impairment progresses to have Alzheimer's disease and dementia, but everybody who has Alzheimer's disease will pass through mild cognitive impairment first. This study was done with people with mild cognitive impairment, and they were put into 2 arms of the study. One was sort of more traditional aerobic exercise, And one was like a stretching, strength, and balance training. So they were given specific exercises to do with a specific target rate for every week. What was great about this was that after 12 months, study participants who had mild cognitive impairment in both arms showed no cognitive decline. Now that's exciting because not every older adult, 65, 75, 85, can get on a treadmill for 40 minutes, 3 to 4 times a day safely. And so here's a study that shows that there are other ways we can protect our brain through exercise that may have as much protection. So just a great one for people to think about if you're working with older adults who might have some physical limitations. Next slide. Now, the Sprint Mind study really took a deeper look at some of those other cardiovascular risk factors like blood pressure in particular. 25% of our blood pumps from every heartbeat goes to our brain. So it makes sense that we should be thinking about what's good for the heart is good for the brain. If you think about some of these things that I've said, healthier diets, exercise, keeping active, not smoking, protecting our brain, all things that we would say are good for good cardiovascular health as well. But the Sprint Mind study really put the test to blood pressure. And what they did in this trial was they put people in 2 arms of the trial. And it was specifically looking at the systolic level of your blood pressure, keeping the systolic at either what was considered to be normal systolic at the time, which was 140 systolic, versus what they were calling an intensive treatment, which was 120 systolic. And what was great about this study is they were allowed to use blood pressure medication. So it wasn't just getting people to eat right and exercise and try and lower their blood pressure that way. They were able to use blood pressure medication to keep that blood pressure low. And you can see here that in the intensive arm, there was a 19% reduced risk for mild cognitive impairment, a 17% reduced risk for dementia, and a 15% reduced risk when you looked at both of those things together. And we're actually going to continue to see these patients out over another few years in the Sprint Mind 2.0 study to really think about that dementia risk. Dementia happens over time, it doesn't happen overnight. So we need that time to be able to study people over the next several years. And today, if you were to look up what normal blood pressure is considered, it's considered to be 120 systolic, not 140 systolic. So again, what can you do today? If you have high blood pressure, talk to your general practitioner about what you can be doing to reduce and lower your blood pressure. It's so important. Next slide, please. And finally, as Shannon mentioned when she was introducing me, one of, I think, the best parts about my job is being able to work on the US Pointer study. So this is a clinical trial that is putting all of these risk reduction strategies together to say, can we have the maximum benefit if we do all of these things together? And what this study is actually looking at is 2 different modalities of delivering those interventions. So participants in this clinical trial that's happening across 5 sites in the United States, UC Davis in Sacramento is one of those 5 sites, is randomizing participants into one of 2 arms, self-guided or structured. So in structured, think Weight Watchers. They have weekly meetings and they have lessons and they get that information with a navigator and an interventionist who's teaching them how to make these changes. The self-guided arm meets for the same amount of time, 2 years, but only meets 6 times the entire 2 years. They're given the information. They have a navigator who checks in with them periodically, but not quite as frequently as the structured. 2 different formats, a little bit different expectations, sort of told, go chart your own course. When you think of how you replicate this in community, I'm a little biased to think that self-guided has more legs, right? To think about how do we sustain this? Should the clinical trial prove that we can reduce our risk through these lifestyle changes? This is a trial that finished recruitment in March of 2023. So we've got about a year and a bit left to go for the last participants to go through that 2-year trial. And that's when we'll then be able to start looking at this data to see whether or not, if we can prove it effective, it could lead to the way we think about accessible and sustainable community-based programs for prevention. And you'll see here the National Institute on Aging is supporting this study through 4 what we call ancillary studies. These are studies that participants can opt into participating in. One is looking at neuroimaging, one is looking at sleep, and how important sleep is, not just getting enough sleep, but the quality of your sleep, and whether or not you have things like sleep apnea. One is looking at your neurovascular system, and then one is looking at that gut health, the microbiome. So we'll get more and more data to sort of support the importance of good gut health. Next slide, please. This is a study that was based off of a very successful trial in Finland called the FINGER trial. And you can see here, and this map is a little outdated, those orange countries are probably well purple now. That means they're already in the process of implementing a finger, what we call a finger-like study. So it's taking those lifestyle changes from Finland, but making them replicate the community that you live in. So as you can imagine, the lifestyle changes in Finland look a little bit different than the lifestyle changes in the United States, just as our diet that we're looking at might look different than what the Latin American fingers is looking at, to make sure that we're bringing in that cultural component that can still find the same healthy benefits, and yet meets the culture of that country. And so it's a really exciting thing to see as we start to think about cognitive impairment and dementia worldwide. Next slide, please. Now, that's a lot about what's happening. What about those that are living with Alzheimer's disease today? Well, the impact on families, as you can see here, is really staggering, and 2/3 of caregivers are women. 1/3 of dementia caregivers are daughters. 83% of the help provided to older adults in the United States comes from family members and friends. And as we saw in the facts and figures, that equates to over $271 billion worth of unpaid care. This is a physical, emotional, social, and financial toll on families. And so while what we talked about earlier is wonderful and it's exciting, there are still 6 million Americans and their families that have to deal with the impact of Alzheimer's disease every day. Next slide, please. So we want you to know that it has an impact on our work. It can create opportunities for families to feel unsettled in their work. 18% of people had to change from full-time to part-time. That has an impact on the family's financial health. 57% of people had to go in late or leave early or take time off. 8% of people had to turn down a promotion. 9% had to quit their work entirely, or 17% had to lost their job benefits. And so the effects of caregiving on the workplace are staggering. And one of the reasons we wanted to have this presentation was to not only raise the awareness of that and all the great work that's happening, but also to let people know that there are support services and help out there. Next slide, please. And because of this impact on jobs, it then translates into impact of Alzheimer's on families, on the finances. And we know the cost of this disease is devastating. And it really has an impact on not just income, but where people are, the potential for lost income, but our expenses go up. Not because necessarily they're paying for lots of fancy treatments and expensive medications, but the day-to-day care to have someone supported who might need 24-hour care, and the fact that people live on average anywhere from 8 to 20 years with Alzheimer's disease make it incredibly difficult. Families have to reduce those hours. They have to take off time, and it can really take a cut into retirement and as well as just overall function of a family. Next slide, please. It can also take a toll on the caregivers. And I think caregiver stress is one of the things that we worry about the most. So if you are a caregiver, we know how overwhelming it can be, and we want you to know that there are support services out there for you. But caregiver stress is often ignored, and for all the reasons you can imagine, but just gives you a little bit of a sign on the right of what you could be looking for. I think families oftentimes don't think things are as bad as they really are, because it's really hard to see it when you have tunnel vision and you're in it. You can withdraw from friends or families or activities. An increase in anxiety and depression, we often see that health problems can take a physical toll and are oftentimes not treated by their own doctor. It's a really good opportunity to just level set if you're a caregiver and think about your own health, and making a priority for that. Next slide, please. And Rosalind Carter said once, there are only 4 kinds of people in the world: those who have been caregivers, those who are caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need caregivers. And that's why we wanted to talk about not just, like I said, the exciting parts of what's happening, but the reality of what families are facing every day, and to just make sure that families know that they can be connected to support services. Next slide, please. So this is what you can do. First of all, know that we are here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week through our 800 number. Hopefully you can write it down. Perhaps we can put it in the chat as well. 800-272-3900. We have clinicians available day and night to answer your questions, just to be a friendly listening ear on the other end of the line. We know how important taking care of yourself and exercising and eating right are. We just learned about how it can reduce your own risks of dementia, but it's also good for managing your stress as well. And it's important to think about how you can get support and a break if you're caring for someone at home. Next slide, please. And we are here through not just the helpline, but we have a number of educational programs that can support in skills building classes around communication and behaviors and just understanding the disease, as well as how to help with some concrete steps. Our website, alz.org, is always a great place to go, not only to learn about what's happening in the community as far as programs, but to get information as well, to kind of understand a little bit more. And we have a couple of online programs that can help you connect to other people living with the disease, or to create your own care plan through Alz Connected and our Alzheimer's Navigator program. Next slide, please. That might be it. Yeah, so hopefully I didn't leave much time for questions, but hopefully that's given you a little bit of a summary and what we can all do together. I'm so grateful for King Wealth Planning for inviting us to really just share a little bit about how we can support you and what we can all be doing together, because this disease really does take everybody working together.
Clara, thank you so much. Very enlightening and great information. And I'll definitely send out some information on alz.org and the 800 number, which is 800-272-3900. If anyone's got any questions, please go ahead and email me at kwp@kingwealth.com. One question I had for you, Claire, is can you get the Aduhelm and Leqembi from your doctor?
Well, that's a great question, Shannon. So right now, those medications, you would need to check in with your physician about, there are pros and cons to every medication, and these are definitely ones that need to be discussed with your healthcare professionals. These are intravenous therapies. So you would have to go to a system where you're able to not only get the treatment, and the treatment is delivered anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the treatment. And I should also add that Aduhelm probably not the strongest data coming out of the gate. Leqembi definitely had a little bit stronger data, met its primary endpoints for the clinical trial. And because of that, Aduhelm has made the decision that they're not going to be offering that medication beyond, I think, November of this year. But Leqembi is definitely a new treatment that's available. Health systems have had to kind of figure out how to ready themselves to be able to deliver this, because you do have to have a couple of things cleared. One, you have to have evidence of amyloid. So it means getting some sort of biomarker test to ensure that you do have the presence of amyloid. And then they do monitor for some of the side effects, which like any medication, some are a little bit more serious than others. And so it's important that that clinicians are monitoring for these side effects. The most common of which is something called ARIA, which stands for amyloid-related imaging abnormality, which is it sounds scary. It's a swelling of the brain. Many patients who experienced ARIA in the clinical trials didn't know that they had ARIA, but they monitor for this regularly. It is just a product of amyloid treatments. And so it's sort of one of those things that the clinical side is working to figure out how to monitor. So for now, you can do a couple of things. You can certainly call our 800 number and find where what sites are administering the Leqembi or Aduhelm, or talk with your healthcare professional. It's a great question.
Okay, one question someone had was, will King Wealth Planning be doing an impact of Alzheimer's on finances education? So I want to tell clients and others watching, yes, we will work with the Alzheimer's Association to put something together like that for you.
That'd be great.
Okay. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining today's collaboration between King Wealth Planning and the Alzheimer's Association. We hope you take away more than you expected. King Wealth will be doing more of these events as we just discussed this year, so stay connected to us on social media and our website. And we work closely with our community to bring individuals and families education like this, because we want to use our platform to give back and to make the world just a little bit better. It's something that's important to us, and I hope it's also important to you. Thanks again, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you, Shannon.